Number 10, Chazakiel. In 1 Enoch, chapter 8, verse 3, in the middle of a list of angels teaching humanity things no human was meant to know, one name is attached to a skill that sounds harmless. Chazakiel taught the knowledge of the clouds. In some manuscripts, the spelling is Ezekiel. In others, it appears as Shahakiel. The Aramaic fragments recovered from the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran preserve the name with variations that scholars still argue about 100 years after they were first published. The meaning of the name shifts too. Some translators render it Cloud of God. Michael Knibb, the Oxford scholar who produced one of the standard English editions of the Ethiopic text, translates it as Shooting Star of God. The manuscript tradition disagrees. The teaching does not. Chazakiel showed humans how to read the sky, not the movement of stars. That belongs to another angel, further down the list. Chazakiel taught weather divination, the shape of a thunderhead, the direction of a wind across the tops of trees, the color of a horizon at sunset, the height of cloud layers stacked one atop another, the way moisture builds in the air before a storm actually arrives, the scent of ozone before the first drop falls. He handed humanity the ability to look up and know what the atmosphere was about to do hours before it did it. And to a reader in the modern world, that sounds like meteorology, and meteorology sounds like a scientific gift. It saves lives. It routes ships around hurricanes. It tells a farmer when to plant and when to hold back. It grounds aircraft before storms. Why would an ancient book condemn the being who first taught it? The answer sits in the Enochic worldview itself. The sky belonged to God. The clouds were his throne, his messengers, his chariot. In the book of Exodus, he leads Israel through the wilderness by day in a pillar of cloud. And in the Psalms, he makes the clouds his chariot and walks upon the wings of the wind. Reading the clouds was reading his mind. The Book of 1 Enoch treats every heavenly domain as sealed knowledge, and Chazakiel broke that seal. He turned the sky from a mystery into a text, and once humanity could read it, they stopped asking heaven to explain it. They stopped kneeling. They stopped waiting. The rain was no longer a blessing. It was a prediction. The drought was no longer a punishment. It was a system. And with that shift, the text says, came the first spiritual decay attached to weather. Priests who claimed to predict storms could demand payment in grain and gold. Kings who claimed to summon rain could demand worship from their subjects. Charlatans who read the clouds could sell false comfort to desperate farmers watching their crops die. The knowledge was real. The corruption was in the ownership. Chazakiel gave humanity a piece of the sky, and humanity turned it into a business. That is what the text says the cost was, not the science itself. The severance. The moment a person no longer needed to look up at the storm and feel small. Every rain dance charlatan in every ancient culture. Every court astrologer who used weather forecasts to sway a king. Every drought cult that demanded human sacrifice to end a dry season. Every insurance premium calculated against a weather pattern. Every futures trader betting against a hurricane. The industry of weather knowledge, in the framework of 1 Enoch, is Chazakiel's inheritance to a species that no longer looks up in awe, but only in calculation. And the Book of 1 Enoch, chapter 8, verse 4, tells us how heaven responded to all of this. As men perished, they cried, and their cry went up to heaven. The knowledge Chazakiel gave them did not save them. It marked the beginning of a corruption so widespread that the earth itself began screaming for help. Number 9, Kokabel, the fourth name in the roster of 20 chief watchers listed in 1 Enoch, chapter 6, verse 7. His name means Star of God. Kokabel, in some translations, Kokabel in others. Kokabel in the Ethiopic manuscript preserved by the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, which is the only Christian body that still treats 1 Enoch as full scripture. The spellings vary because the Aramaic original was translated into Greek, and then the Greek was translated into Ge'ez, and each transmission dropped or added letters in the way that ancient names always shift when they cross alphabets. What did not vary is the teaching. In 1 Enoch, chapter 8, Kokabel taught humanity the constellations, the signs of the stars, the lore of the fixed points of light that seem to move across the heavens through the year. He showed humans how to divide the night sky into shapes, how to give those shapes names, how to attach those names to seasons, personalities, earths, and fates. He invented what we now call astrology. Some later sources say he commanded an army of 365,000 spirits, one for every day and quarter day of the year, and that alone gives you a sense of how deep the ancient tradition ran on this figure. And to understand why his teaching was forbidden, you have to understand what the ancient world thought stars actually were. Stars were not distant suns. Stars were not balls of hydrogen and helium burning across billions of years. Stars were living beings, angelic entities, fixed points of divine presence pinned to the vault of heaven. To read them was to read the language of God's counsel. To predict a person's future from the alignment of stars at their birth was to claim that God had written a script and that a human being could steal the pages before the play was performed. The Book of Enoch treats this as theft. It treats astrology not as a science, but as an invasion. Some later Jewish texts, including sections of the Book of the Angel Raziel, actually list Kokabel among the holy angels, suggesting his rebellion was not universally accepted across the tradition. Where manuscripts disagree, the disagreement itself is worth naming out loud. But in the dominant reading of Enoch, Kokabel is a rebel, and his teaching is a fracture in the wall between the seen and the unseen. And here is the shocking part. Every horoscope column printed in every newspaper for the last century traces its logic back to the exact skill Kokabel is condemned for teaching. Every zodiac sign, every rising sign, every retrograde warning, every claim that a person's personality is written in the sky sits on a foundation the Book of Enoch calls forbidden. Whether you believe any of it or not, one detail is undeniable. A tradition that predates the pyramids that shaped Babylonian temples and Roman emperors, and modern dating apps is credited by an ancient Jewish text to a single angel who was punished for teaching it. The Babylonians built entire observatories to track planetary movement. The Egyptians aligned the pyramids of Giza to the belt of Orion. The Chinese court astronomers were executed if they failed to predict eclipses. Kokabel's gift did not disappear when the flood came. It walked into every civilization that followed and kept teaching itself. And the text is precise about what the corruption was. It was not the observation of the stars. Humans could always look up. It was the interpretation. It was the claim that the stars ruled the person, that a child born under a certain constellation was fated to be a certain kind of adult, that a war launched under a certain sky would be won or lost regardless of the courage of the soldiers. Astrology, in the Enochic frame, did not just steal knowledge from heaven, it stole responsibility from humanity. If your fate was written in the stars, then your choices did not matter. If your marriage was doomed by an incompatibility of birth charts, then you never had to try to save it. If your king was destined to rule by the alignment of Jupiter and Mars, then no revolution could ever be justified. Kokabel's teaching, in the logic of the text, made humans passive. It gave them permission to blame the sky for everything they should have owned themselves. The text ends his section by saying, humanity cried out, and their voices reached heaven, not because they hated the knowledge, because they had drowned in it, because they no longer knew how to make a decision without first consulting a chart. Number 8. Barakiel. In the older R.H. Charles translation from 1917, sometimes Barakiel in modern editions. The Aramaic root is Barakiel, the ninth of the 20 Watcher Chiefs, named in 1 Enoch, chapter 6, verse 7, and he shows up again in the shorter list of teachers in chapter 8, verse 3. The meaning of the name is unambiguous even when the spelling isn't. Barak is the Hebrew word for lightning. It appears in the book of Judges as the personal name of the general who fought alongside the prophetess Deborah, and it means exactly what it looks like, lightning. El is God, Barakiel is the lightning of God. And what did the lightning of God teach humanity? In the shorter list of 1 Enoch, chapter 8, he is credited with astrology, but the older manuscript tradition, and the way most scholars read the passage in light of his name, gives him something more specific. Barakiel taught divination by lightning. In the ancient world, this was a recognized branch of prophecy, and it had its own name. The Greeks called it cerealnoscopy. The Romans called practitioners of it vulgariators. The Etruscans built entire schools of trained priests around it, and the Roman Senate, at the height of the Republic, still consulted these Etruscan lightning readers before making major decisions of state. A priest would watch a thunderstorm, note the color of each bolt, the quadrant of sky it fell from, the sound it made, the object it struck, and from those readings would announce the will of the gods, whether a king should march to war, whether a marriage should proceed, whether a temple should be built on that ground or another, whether a coin should be struck with a particular emperor's face. Lightning was believed to be the direct finger of the divine, pointing at what mattered, and Barakiel, according to 1 Enoch, taught humanity how to read the finger. Understand what this meant in the Enochic frame. Lightning was not weather, lightning was speech. Every bolt that split a sky was a word from heaven, delivered without mediation, without translation, without the softening filter of a prophet's mouth. When Barakiel taught humans to interpret those bolts, he did not give them a science. He gave them a way to eavesdrop on divine conversation, to intercept the messages that were meant for other angels, other councils, other courts. He turned the storm into a wiretap. And once humans could interpret lightning, they no longer needed prophets. They no longer needed priests to bring them the word of God. They could stand in a field, watch the sky rupture, and claim they had heard the voice themselves. That is what the text treats as the corruption, not the observation, the claim of hearing. And there is a strange aftershock to Barakiel's story that deserves to be named honestly. In 3 Enoch, a much later Hebrew mystical text that dates centuries after the original 1 Enoch material, an angel with a similar name is listed among the holy princes appointed over lightning, so the tradition splits. In one strand, Barakiel is a rebel. In another, he is a legitimate steward of the storm. This is exactly the kind of disagreement that Enochic literature is full of, and it is worth naming rather than smoothing over. What every version agrees on is that the sky is not silent, and the men who first claimed to translate it did not learn how on their own. Every ancient king who launched a war after seeing lightning strike a favorable tree, every judge who ruled against a defendant because thunder rolled during the testimony, every general who abandoned a battlefield because a bolt struck his own tent, every superstition that still makes people count the seconds between flash and thunder as if the sky were sending a personal message. All of it, in the logic of 1 Enoch, is Barakiel's legacy. He taught humanity to hear voices in the storm, and humanity has been listening ever since, sometimes to messages that were never sent at all. Number 7. Armaros, the 11th on the roster in 1 Enoch, chapter 6. The name means cursed one in some readings, the one from Herman in others, and Michael Knibb argues the original Aramaic form may have been Armoni distorted through Greek transmission into the shape we now have. The manuscript disagreement is genuine and worth naming. What Armaros taught, however, is preserved with unusual precision across every recension. He taught the undoing of enchantments, the release of spells, the breaking of curses, counter magic, and to a modern reader, this is where the Book of 1 Enoch stops making obvious sense and starts revealing its actual logic. Because at first glance, Armaros should be the good one. If Amazarak taught how to cast spells and Armaros taught how to break them, is Armaros not the antidote? Is the ability to undo a curse not a mercy? The text says no. The text puts him in the same list as the angels who invented the curses in the first place. He is not a healer, he is a rebel. Why? Because in the Enochic worldview, spells were not neutral tools that could be used for good or evil depending on the caster. Spells were a violation. They were the manipulation of forces that belonged to God forces, meant to remain outside human hands entirely. When Amazarak taught spells, he taught humans to seize power that was not theirs. When Armaros taught the release of those spells, he did not restore the natural order. He locked humans inside the spell system permanently, because now, when a curse was cast, the only defense was another spell. The victim had no recourse to heaven, no priest to intercede, no sacrifice to offer that would work. They had to find someone trained in Armaros' art, pay them whatever the market would bear, and hope the counterspell was strong enough to overcome the original binding. Armaros made spellcraft self-sustaining. He guaranteed that humanity would need magicians forever. He is the reason, in the logic of 1 Enoch, that magical arts spread instead of dying out. Because a system where offense exists but no defense exists collapses. Nobody uses a weapon that has no counter, because they know it will eventually be used against them. But a system where offense and defense both exist, where every attack has a possible parry, becomes an arms race. And an arms race sustains itself. Every wizard who ever cast a curse ensured the market for curse breakers. Every curse breaker who ever undid a hex ensured the market for stronger hexes. Every witch, every charm breaker, every witch hunter, every exorcist who works within a magical framework instead of a divine one owes their profession in the Enochic reading to Armaros. He built the market. He built the demand. He built the trap that keeps humanity dependent on the very forces they should have refused to touch. Some later occult traditions kept his name in circulation for exactly this reason. Grimoires and demonology dictionaries from the medieval period list him as an angel to invoke when a binding needs breaking. The Book of 1 Enoch would consider that continuation a proof of concept. Armaros did his job so well that 3,000 years later, people still call his name to fix problems his colleagues created. And there is one more layer to his cost that the text implies but does not state outright. The ability to break a spell also means the ability to break a legitimate binding, a promise, a vow, a sacred oath. Once humans learned that any spell could be released with the right counter formula, the concept of an unbreakable word began to erode. The wedding vow that could not be undone, the blood oath between allies that had to be honored to the death, the temple pledge that bound a priest for life. All of these depended on the belief that some bindings were absolute. Armaros taught humanity that no binding is absolute, that every promise has an escape clause if you know the right words to whisper. He did not just teach counter magic, he taught the deeper lesson that lies underneath counter magic, which is that nothing sworn is truly permanent. That teaching has done more damage to human society in the framework of the text than any single curse he ever unbound. Number 6. Amazarak. The name appears in different manuscripts as Amazarak, Amazarox, or in some recensions is folded back into Shemyaza himself. This is one of the places where the textual tradition genuinely fractures, and honesty requires saying so clearly. In the R.H. Charles translation from 1917, the passage in 1 Enoch, chapter 8, verse 3, credits Shemyaza with the teaching. In other manuscript families, the same body of forbidden knowledge is attributed to a separate angel named Amazarak. For clarity, we will treat Amazarak as the teacher here, with the caveat that some readers will recognize the same skills under the ringleader's name in older editions. What did he teach? 2 things, listed in a single tight phrase that has resonated through millennia of Jewish and Christian magical anxiety: the casting of spells and the cutting of roots. The first half sounds straightforward: spellcraft. The vocalization of specific words in specific orders to produce specific supernatural effects. The construction of incantations, the learning of secret names, the invocation of powers that a human being had no natural right to command. That alone would be enough to earn condemnation. But it is the second half of the phrase that modern readers usually skim over and that arguably matters more. The cutting of roots meant herbalism, but not gentle herbalism. Not the kind that produces a soothing chamomile tea. The cutting of roots meant the deliberate harvest of specific plants at specific times of the lunar cycle, prepared in specific ways, to produce specific magical or medicinal effects. Amazarak taught humans which roots would induce sleep, which would induce prophetic dreams, which would poison a rival without leaving any mark on the body a coroner could find, which would end an unwanted pregnancy, which would inflame passion in a target who had rejected the caster, which would silence a witness by making him unable to speak on the day of trial, which would drive a lover mad, which would blind an accuser. This was not gardening. This was pharmacological warfare disguised as agriculture, and it was practiced under the cover of religion for thousands of years. And when combined with the spell casting Amazarak also taught, humanity received a complete magical technology, the words to cast a curse, the plants to enforce the physical symptoms, the rituals to hide the trail. The Book of Enoch treats this pairing as the moment magic became practical. Before Amazarak, if a person wanted to harm an enemy, they had to do it with their hands. They had to lift a stone, they had to draw a knife, they had to look their target in the eye and commit the physical act. After Amazarak, they could do it with a whisper spoken at a distance and a bundle of dried leaves slipped into a cup at a feast. The distance between intention and result collapsed to nothing, and that collapse is what the text mourns, not the plants themselves, not the vocabulary of chant, the removal of moral friction. When killing your neighbor requires you to lift a stone and swing it, most people never do. When killing your neighbor requires you to grind a root, boil it in wine, and slip it into a cup at a wedding held by someone else in a house you were never seen entering, the barrier drops. That is what Amazarak taught. Not medicine, not gardening, the chemistry of resentment. Every poisoning in every royal court from Alexander of Macedon to the Borgias of Renaissance Rome, to the Romanovs of Imperial Russia, to the modern espionage cases sitting in newspaper archives right now, is, in the logic of 1 Enoch, a footnote to this angel's lesson. Every rival heir who died mysteriously at a banquet, every uncomfortable senator who suddenly took ill after receiving a gift, every unwanted spouse who wasted away over months, every whistleblower who collapsed from a cause the physicians could not name. The pattern is old, and the text says it began with a single watcher who taught humanity that intention plus botany plus incantation could reach through walls and kill. Amazarak taught humanity to fight without touching, and humanity has been perfecting that lesson ever since. Number 5, Penemue, and now the countdown turns strange. Because the next teaching, delivered by the fourth of the 5 Satans named in 1 Enoch chapter 69, is not a weapon, not a poison, not a spell. It is something you are using to read these words right now. Penemue, the text says in verse 8 and verse 9 of chapter 69, taught the children of men the bitter and the sweet, and instructed mankind in writing with ink and paper, and then the text delivers one of the most jarring theological statements in the entire book. Thereby many sinned from eternity to eternity and until this day. Read that carefully. Writing itself. The transmission of language through symbol on a surface. The invention that allowed every scripture, every law code, every love letter, every scientific formula, every apology, every promise, every recipe, every prayer to survive its speaker. This, the Book of 1 Enoch, calls a forbidden gift. And it goes further. Verse 10 says, humans were not created for this purpose, to give confirmation to their good faith with pen and ink. Verse 11 explains why. Humans, the text argues, were created exactly like the angels, meant to remain pure and righteous, and death, which destroys everything, could not have taken hold of them. But through this knowledge, through writing, they are perishing. Why would writing kill? The reasoning is subtle and worth slowing down for. In the world before Penemue, according to the text, human agreements were held by the weight of the spoken word. A promise was a promise because a person's voice was inseparable from their soul. If they broke it, the breaking cost them something spiritual. When you swore with your whole being. Your body knew you had committed. Your neighbors heard you commit. Your children witnessed the sound of your voice binding you. Writing changed that. Writing let a person outsource their word to a page. They could sign a contract without meaning it. They could record a vow without living it. They could put their name to something and let the ink do the remembering while their heart moved on to the next deal. Writing separated the promise from the promise maker. It allowed lies to be preserved with the same permanence as truth. It let a king issue an execution order without ever raising his voice, without ever looking the condemned in the eye. It let a merchant defraud a farmer with a document the farmer could not read. It let a slave trader falsify a bill of sale that turned a free man into property with the stroke of a pen. Every legal system that ever oppressed the illiterate, every propaganda pamphlet that ever recruited a mob to violence, every falsified will that ever disinherited a widow, every forgery, every censored book, every burned library, every ledger that recorded a debt with interest that could never be repaid. All of it, the text argues, became possible the moment Penemue put a stylus in a human hand. The gift that built civilization is, in the Book of Enoch, the gift that also lets civilization industrialize its dishonesty. And the text does not celebrate the trade-off. It grieves it. The final line of verse 11 breaks into a first-person lament. Through this power it is consuming me, a phrase whose speaker is disputed by scholars, but whose despair is unmistakable. Something in the cosmos, the text says, is still being eaten by the fact that Penemue taught us to write. And the paradox is complete when you consider that the very book making this argument is a written text. The Book of Enoch, which condemns writing as a forbidden gift, could only reach us because Penemue's teaching survived. Every sentence you are hearing right now depends on the exact invention the text calls a curse. That paradox is not accidental. The author is asking the reader to sit with it, to recognize that even the sacred texts we depend on are contaminated by the medium that carries them. Writing preserved wisdom. Yes. It also preserved every lie ever told. It gave voice to prophets. Yes. It also gave voice to tyrants who could now issue decrees across an empire without ever having to face the subjects they were oppressing. Penemue's cost is not measured in bodies. It is measured in the erosion of a certain kind of human integrity, the kind that could only survive in a world where you had to say what you meant, out loud, in front of witnesses, and stand behind it with your voice. Number 4. Gadriel, the third of the 5 Satans listed in 1 Enoch, chapter 69, and the angel whose teachings inaugurated the entire industry of human warfare. Verse 6 identifies him by name and delivers the charge in a single devastating phrase. Gadriel showed the children of men all the blows of death. Read that phrase again. Not the weapons of death. That comes in the next verse. First, the blows, the strikes themselves. The knowledge of how to kill another human being with efficiency, where to place a spear point, to punch through a rib cage, how to angle a blade so it slides past bone into an artery, which side of a helmet is thinnest, which joint of armor a hammer will crack, the choreography of murder. That is what Gadriel taught first. He taught the technique before he taught the tool. Because a weapon in an untrained hand is a hazard to its wielder. A weapon in a trained hand is a certainty. Gadriel closed that gap. He gave humanity not just the sword, but the swordsmanship, not just the spear, but the spear thrust, not just the shield, but the shield wall. And then verse 7 completes the indictment. He showed the weapons of death to the sons of men, the shield and the coat of mail, and the sword for slaughter, and all the weapons of death to the sons of men. And from his hand they have gone out against those who dwell the dry ground from that time and forever and ever. Every battlefield in human history, every siege, every ambush, every uniform, every rifle, every drone, every trench, every landmine, every tank, every fortification. From that day and forever and ever, the text says, they have proceeded from his hand. That is not a metaphor in the Enochic frame. That is a genealogy. The text is telling you that every arms manufacturer alive today is the direct heir of a teaching delivered by a watcher who chose to hand humanity the technical vocabulary of violence. Astonishingly, the same verse contains one more accusation, thrown in almost as an aside that will resonate through the rest of Western religious tradition. Gadriel also led Eve astray. That is all the text says on the matter, and this video will honor that brevity, but understand what a claim it is. The serpent in the garden, in this Enochic tradition, has a name, and the name is Gadriel, and he is the same angel who invented sword fighting. Which raises a question the Book of Enoch does not answer directly but leaves hanging in the reader's mind. Was the fall of humanity, in this framework, always about violence? Was the first deception in Eden connected to the same teacher who eventually put a blade in the first soldier's hand? The text lets you draw the line yourself. What it commits to explicitly is the accounting. Every war ever fought, every civilian killed in crossfire, every child conscripted into a militia, every soldier who did not come home, every widow who received a telegram, every orphan raised on a father's medals instead of a father's voice, Every mass grave dug in secret and covered before dawn. All of it, in the logic of 1 Enoch, chapter 69, verse 7, proceeded from the hand of one angel who thought humanity would benefit from knowing how to fight. The cost has been running for as long as recorded history and shows no sign of stopping. Consider what Gadriel handed humanity specifically. The shield, which turned defense into a profession. The coat of mail, which turned a soldier into a fortress. The sword for slaughter, which turned killing into a craft with masters and apprentices and workshops that passed the trade down through generations. These are not primitive weapons. These are the components of an organized military. Gadriel did not teach humanity to throw a rock. Humanity already knew how to throw rocks. He taught humanity to organize violence, to standardize it, to make it repeatable, to make it a profession that a young man could enter and be honored for. He created the soldier as a social role. And once the soldier existed, the state that could pay soldiers existed, and once the state existed, the empire existed. And once the empire existed, the endless cycle of conquest and revolt and reconquest existed. Every geopolitical map in every history textbook is drawn along lines that were originally sword strokes. Gadriel taught the blows of death, and the earth has been counting the dead ever since. The text does not exaggerate when it says, "His teachings have proceeded against those who dwell the dry ground from that day and forevermore." It is simply describing what has happened. Every century since has been a demonstration of the truth of the accusation. Number 3. Kasdeja. If Penemue's teaching was shocking because of its ordinariness and Gadriel's was shocking because of its scale, then Kasdeja's is shocking because of its precision. The fifth and final Satan named in 1 Enoch chapter 69 appears in verse 12, and his catalog of teachings is the darkest list in the entire book. The text does not soften it. It does not hedge. It reads it out like a court indictment written by a prosecutor who has already made up his mind. Kasdeja showed the children of men all the wicked smitings of spirits and demons. First entry. He taught humans how to strike other humans through the spirit world, how to send an unseen force against a rival, how to arrange for a person to fall sick without any visible cause, how to invite a demon into an enemy's household under the guise of hospitality, the mechanics of supernatural assault, second entry. He taught the smitings of the embryo in the womb, that it may pass away. Read that carefully. He taught humans how to end a pregnancy through spiritual violence, not through herbs. That was Amazarak's territory. Through the direct intervention of malignant force against a life that had not yet drawn breath. The Book of 1 Enoch names this teaching in a single clinical clause and moves on. But the weight of the clause does not move on. It sits there, on the page, as an accusation against an angel who thought the unborn were fair game for his instructional catalog. Third entry. The bites of the serpent. Kasdeja taught the striking of humans by snakes, whether that meant literal snake handling as a weapon, or the summoning of serpent spirits, or the crafting of venom into a tool of assassination. The text does not elaborate. It does not need to. Every ancient culture had stories of assassins who used vipers as weapons. Cleopatra's death, whether by asp or by other means, entered history as an image precisely because the ancient world already understood snake death as a signature. Kasdeja's teaching, in the framework of 1 Enoch, is the origin of that image. He gave humanity the knowledge that a snake could be used, aimed, deployed against a target in a way that would look accidental to any witness. Fourth entry. And the strangest of them all, the smitings which befall through the noontide heat. Sunstroke. Weaponized weather at the personal scale, the ability to make a person collapse in a field under the midday sun through spiritual manipulation. The text names a son of the serpent called Tabaet. In connection with this teaching, though the reference is obscure and the manuscript tradition here is corrupted in places, with some editions leaving the name blank and others filling it in with slightly different spellings. What is clear is the pattern. Kasdeja specialized in invisible attacks. Attacks that leave no wound the physician can identify, attacks that cannot be traced to a human hand, attacks against the unborn, the sleeping, the vulnerable, the person walking alone across an open field at noon with no witnesses. This is the angel who taught humanity to harm without being caught. And in a text obsessed with the corruption of the earth, no teaching is treated as more corrupting, because a sword can be dropped and identified as a murder weapon. A poison can be tested and traced back to a plant. A spell can be broken by Armaros' counter magic. But a demon strike, the text implies, cannot be undone by any human means. It works in a realm where the victim has no defense, where the attacker leaves no evidence, where the death looks like nothing more than misfortune. Kasdeja placed weapons in humanity's hands that humanity was never supposed to know existed, and he did it. The text says so casually that his teachings fit into a single verse. Consider the moral architecture of that verse. Every other angel on this list taught skills that could theoretically be used for good as well as evil. Weapons could defend the innocent, cosmetics could dignify the wearer, astrology could inspire humility before the vastness of the cosmos. Writing could preserve wisdom. Spellcraft could heal as well as harm. Even root cutting had medicinal applications alongside its poisons. But Kasdeja's teachings have no defensive analog. There is no legitimate use for a demon strike. There is no wholesome application for terminating an unborn child through supernatural violence. There is no ethical school of noontide heat weaponry. The teachings themselves are pure malice, dressed up as knowledge. That is why Kasdeja ranks so high on this list, and why the text places him at the end of Chapter 69's catalog as if he is the final proof of how far the fall of the Watchers went. When an angel begins teaching humanity how to kill embryos in the womb through spiritual assault, the argument for redemption of the fallen becomes very hard to make. The Book of Enoch, in listing his teachings, is not asking the reader to sympathize with Kasdeja. It is asking the reader to understand exactly how bad it got and how quickly. Number 2, Shemyaza. In some manuscripts, Shemyaza. In others, Samlazes. In the Aramaic Dead Sea Scroll fragments recovered from Cave 4 at Qumran, Shemyaza. The name is generally understood to mean "my name has seen," or "the name has seen," a construction that in the context of the text is grimly ironic. Because the name that saw was God's, and what he saw was his angel's rebellion, and the fact that Shemyaza was named for that all-seeing divine gaze makes his betrayal doubly bitter. He was by his very naming an angel who existed in the closest possible proximity to God's own vision, and he chose to lead a mutiny anyway. Shemyaza was not the deadliest teacher on the list. He did not invent weapons. He did not weaponize the womb, but he did something no other angel in the Book of Enoch did. He organized the fall itself. He is the one who turned individual rebellious impulses into a coordinated conspiracy. In Chapter 6, verses 3 through 6, the text tells the story with a novelist's economy. The angels look down from heaven, see the daughters of men, and want them. They start to plan, and Shemyaza, their chief, stops them. He says something that reveals the entire moral architecture of what is about to happen. "I fear ye will not indeed agree to do this deed, and I alone shall have to pay the penalty of a great sin." He is not worried about God. He is worried that his subordinates will lose their nerve halfway through and leave him holding the entire responsibility. So he demands an insurance policy. He says, in effect, if we do this together, and none of us will be able to back out later. He calls for an oath, and the angels, all 200 of them, gather on the summit of Mount Hermon on the border between what is now Israel and Syria and Lebanon, and swear a mutual curse. If any of us backs out, the rest of us are cursed. If any of us breaks, we all break. They bind themselves to each other with a sworn imprecation. The Hebrew word for that sworn ban is cherem, and the mountain itself gets its name from that word, Mount Hermon. The mountain of the oath. The mountain of the sworn ban. The place where 200 immortals conspired to trap themselves in their own crime by making retreat impossible. And then, only then, they descended. There is even, remarkably, a physical artifact that may or may not be connected to this story. In 1869, the British explorer Sir Charles Warren discovered a stone inscription at a place called Khazar Antar, near the summit of Mount Hermon. The Greek inscription, dated by scholars to somewhere between the 3rd and 5th centuries of the Common Era, reads something like, By command of the great and holy God, those taking an oath go forth from here. The stone now sits in the British Museum. Whether the inscription refers to the Watcher's Oath directly is disputed by scholars, and honesty requires naming that dispute. What is not disputed is that the mountain was known in the ancient world as the Mountain of Oaths, and that the tradition of Shemyaza's binding curse was old enough to leave marks in stone. What did Shemyaza teach once he was on the ground? In the shorter list, in 1 Enoch, chapter 8, verse 3, he is credited with teaching enchantments and root cuttings, the same body of magical knowledge that other manuscript traditions attribute to Amazarak. So there is overlap in the accounting, and that overlap should be acknowledged rather than hidden. What sets Shemyaza apart is not one particular skill on the syllabus. It is the fact that he was the general, the strategist, the one who ensured the descent could not be reversed. Every other angel on this list could have turned back on the way down the mountain. Shemyaza made sure none of them did. He is the reason the rebellion succeeded. And there is one more detail in the Enochic tradition that makes his position uniquely disturbing. In ancient Jewish thought, the name was a title used to refer to God himself when speaking his true name was forbidden, when the divine name was considered too holy to be pronounced aloud. Shemyaza's name contains that word. He was, before the fall, a being of extraordinary rank, close to the divine council associated with the very name that pious Jews would refuse to speak. And he took every angel who followed him down with him. The Book of Enoch does not forgive him for that. It cannot. The text was written in part to explain how such a thing could ever have happened, how celestial beings so close to the throne of God could have chosen to descend and mate with mortal women and teach their offspring the arts of corruption. And the answer the text gives is Shemyaza's name, the one who saw and chose to see wrong, and organized 199 others to see wrong with him. His teaching was not just spellcraft. His teaching was that rebellion, properly organized and properly bound by mutual oath, becomes irreversible. That lesson has been demonstrated in every conspiracy of every century since. Shemyaza taught the mechanics of the point of no return. Every coup that succeeded because the plotters could not back out. Every criminal enterprise that held together because the members had incriminated each other. Every cult that survived internal doubt, because leaving was treated as a betrayal of every remaining member. All of it, in the framework of the text, is the human echo of what Shemyaza taught 200 angels on a mountain in Lebanon in the days of Jared. Number 1, Azazel. There is a reason he stands at the top of this list, and it is not the specific skills he taught. Other angels taught worse things. Kasdeja taught how to strike unborn children through the spirit world. Gadriel taught how to kill a man in single combat. Amazarak taught how to poison a whole household with a bundle of dried leaves. Azazel's teachings in 1 Enoch, chapter 8, verse 1, sound almost mundane by comparison. He taught men to make swords and knives and shields and breastplates, and made known to them the metals of the earth and the art of working them. Metallurgy, the art of the smith, the transformation of rock into blade through the application of heat and hammer. And then he taught something else, and this is the detail that always stops modern readers cold. He taught bracelets and ornaments, and the use of antimony and the beautifying of the eyelids and all kinds of costly stones, and all coloring tinctures. He taught cosmetics. He taught the woman at her mirror how to darken her lash line with antimony powder. He taught the goldsmith how to twist wire into bracelets. He taught the gem cutter how to polish a costly stone until it caught the light and made a wearer seem worthy of a crown. He taught the entire aesthetic vocabulary of ornament. And in one breath, the text pairs it with the manufacture of weapons, swords and eyeliner, shields and bracelets, breastplates and colored dyes. Why? Why are eyeshadow and swords listed together as if they were the same offense? Because in the Enochic frame, they are the same offense. Both are transformations of the natural into the deceptive. The sword transforms iron into an instrument of killing. The cosmetic transforms a face into an instrument of seduction. Both weaponize the raw material into a lie. The sword lies about the balance of power between two men who would otherwise be evenly matched. The cosmetic lies about the appearance of a face that would otherwise be plain. In both cases, the underlying truth of the material is being manipulated for advantage in a contest the wielder could not win without the manipulation. That is how the text reads the pairing. That is why the smith and the cosmetician are indicted by the same verse. And here is the verdict that makes Azazel unique among the fallen, the sentence that earns him the top spot on this list, and that no other angel in the entire Book of Enoch ever receives. In chapter 10, verse 8, God speaks to the archangel Raphael and delivers a judgment that is theologically shocking in its comprehensiveness. The whole earth has been corrupted through the works that were taught by Azazel. To him ascribe all sin. All sin. Not some, not most, not a particular category of sin. All. The Book of Enoch, at this exact moment, does something extraordinary. It gathers the entire moral weight of human corruption and drops it on one being. Why him and not Shemyaza, the ringleader who organized the descent? Why him and not Gadriel, the weapons teacher whose blades still cut? Why him and not Kasdeja, whose teachings were arguably more evil in their specific content? The answer, most scholars believe, lies in the ritual background of the name itself. Azazel appears in the book of Leviticus, chapter 16, as the name attached to the scapegoat rite of the Day of Atonement. On that day, the high priest of Israel would take 2 goats. One was sacrificed to the Lord as a sin offering. The other, the goat for Azazel, had the sins of the entire nation confessed over it by the priest and was then driven out into the wilderness to die alone, carrying the collective guilt of the people away from the community. The Book of Enoch echoes and inverts that ritual with theological precision. It makes Azazel the cosmic scapegoat, the being onto whom all the corruption of humanity is loaded so that the earth can be cleansed. Chapter 10 goes on to describe his fate in vivid detail. Bound hand and foot by Raphael, cast into a pit of jagged rocks in the desert of a place called Dudale. His face covered so he cannot see light, left there until the day of the great judgment when he will be cast into the fire forever. That is one line, and this video will keep it to one line because the punishments of the Watchers belong to a longer story that a separate video will tell. What matters here is why Azazel earned that fate above all the others. It is because his teachings, more than any other angels on the list, blurred the line between what humans are and what humans pretend to be. He taught weapons, which let humans pretend to be stronger than they are. He taught cosmetics, which let them pretend to be more beautiful than they are. He taught metallurgy, which let them pretend to command elements they should have feared and respected. He taught the entire aesthetic and military infrastructure of deception. And once a species starts systematically deceiving itself, the text argues every other sin follows as a matter of course. Murder becomes possible because armor lets murderers walk safely away from the bodies they leave behind. Adultery becomes possible because ornaments let seducers hide their intentions behind the appearance of harmless beauty. Vanity becomes possible because polished mirrors show a version of the self that never really existed and can never really be achieved. Pride becomes possible because a man dressed in gold and iron can convince himself he is more than a mortal. Every sin traces back to a moment of deception, either self-deception or the deception of others, and Azazel taught humanity the practical tools that make every kind of deception possible. All sin, traced back to a single teacher. That is why Azazel is number 1. Not because his lessons were the deadliest in the narrow tactical sense, because his lessons taught humanity to hide. And a species that has learned how to hide from itself and from others is a species that can commit anything and still sleep at night. The text does not exaggerate when it lays the whole earth's corruption at his feet. It is naming the mechanism. Every civilization that ever forged a blade to conquer another civilization, every empire that ever draped its emperors in gold to make them look divine, every court that ever painted its queens to make them seem eternal, every propaganda machine that ever polished a lie until it caught the light like a costly stone. All of it, in the Enochic reading, is a demonstration of the single principle Azazel introduced to the world. That the surface of a thing can be made to lie about the substance of a thing. That the shield can pretend to be invincibility. That the eyeliner can pretend to be youth. That the sword can pretend to be justice. Everything downstream of that principle is what the text means when it says, "To him ascribe all sin." The response from God in the Book of Enoch is the flood. Chapter 10 describes it as a cleanup operation. The angels have corrupted the earth. Their giant children have consumed its resources and turned on its inhabitants. The whole planet is a crime scene. And so God commissions Uriel to warn Noah, commissions Raphael to bind Azazel in the desert pit, Addudael commissions Gabriel to send the giants to destroy each other in mutual war, and commissions Michael to arrest Shemyaza and his companions. And then the water rises. For 40 days and 40 nights, the earth is scrubbed of the knowledge that was never meant to reach it. Everything the fallen angels taught goes underwater. Weapons rust in the depths. Cosmetics dissolve in the tide. Spellbooks decay into unreadable pulp. The ink on Penemue's papers runs and disappears. The blades Gadriel forged sink into silt. The astrological charts Kokabel drew wash away into oceans. The herbal knowledge Amazarak passed down is lost with the herbalists who carried it in their memories. But here is the ending the Book of Enoch leaves the reader with, and it is not the neat ending you might expect. The knowledge survives. Writing survives. Astrology survives. Weather divination survives. Spellcraft survives. Every art the fallen angels are said to have taught is still being practiced somewhere on Earth today, in some form, by some tradition. The flood cleaned the ground. It did not clean the memory. And there is one more thread the text leaves dangling. A thread that changes everything about how you read the story of the flood and everything that came after it. The bodies of the giants died in the water when it rose. Their spirits did not. According to 1 Enoch, chapter 15, the spirits of the Watcher's giant children walked out of their drowned bodies and stayed on the earth as evil spirits, invisible and hungry, wandering the world without form, seeking always to attach themselves to the living. That is a separate story. That is a separate video. But if you take nothing else from this, take this. The Book of Enoch does not treat the fall of the Watchers as ancient history to be studied at a comfortable distance. It treats it as a wound that is still bleeding into every century that follows. Every sword swung in anger, every eyelid darkened in vanity, every horoscope read in earnest, every spell whispered in a candlelit room, every contract signed in bad faith, every unborn child struck in the womb by any means, every forecasted storm that made a merchant rich instead of a village safe, every lightning bolt read as a portent by a king who should have made his own decision. All of it, the text says, is the long tale of a rebellion that happened on a mountain in Lebanon in the days of Jared, before the flood, before the wall between heaven and earth was ever put back into place. 200 angels swore an oath on the summit of Mount Hermon. 10 of them, the ones you have just met, taught humanity what humanity was never meant to know. And the spirits of what they fathered are in the logic of the text, still walking. If you want to know what happened to those spirits, what forms they took, what names they earned, and what the Book of Enoch says they are doing on this earth right now, that story is waiting in the next video.